The first objective of this practical is to introduce the basic structure of an oscilloscope, and the second objective is to get familiar with the use of different switches of this oscilloscope. Now as you can see here, we have an oscilloscope. Now first I will turn it on using this power button here. Now as you can see here, this oscilloscope is turning on, and this is how it looks after being turned on. Now I'm going to calibrate this oscilloscope, and here I'll quickly check whether this oscilloscope is operating correctly or not. For this, I'm going to use this probe. This is one end of this probe and this is the second end. As you can see here, this channel 1 is active, so I'm going to connect this end of this probe here to channel 1, and these leads, they are going to be connected here to these points. This black lead is ground, so I'll connect it here, and I'm going to connect this other lead here to this point which is showing 2 volts square wave. Okay, now after connecting these leads, this is how it looks. Now look at these switches. As you can see here, we have an auto set switch. So after plugging these leads, I'm going to press this auto set button here. Now after pressing this auto set button, this square waveform appears on this display screen. Okay, now here, as you can see, where we have a scale knob. By using this knob, you can change the scale of this waveform. Now look at this. Here I'm just rotating this knob, and as you can see, the scale of this waveform is changing. Okay, now look at this knob. By using this knob, you can change the position of this waveform in horizontal direction. As you can see here, I'm just rotating this knob and the position of this waveform is changing in horizontal direction. Now how you are going to change the position of this waveform in vertical direction? Now look at these position knobs in vertical direction. Here channel 1 is active, so I'm going to use this knob here. Now I'm turning this knob, and as you can see here, the position of this waveform is changing in vertical direction. Okay, now look at these buttons. Okay, now this waveform is continuous, and if I want to make it fixed, I'll use this run or stop button. Now here I have pressed this button and it turned red. It means now your waveform is fixed. Okay, now how you are going to measure this waveform and how you are going to check its peak voltage here? First I'm going to press this measure button. Now after pressing this measure button, these readings appear on the screen. As you can see here, this time is mentioned, here frequency is mentioned, and here DC voltage is also mentioned. Now I'm going to press this cursor button here. After pressing this cursor button, two lines would appear on the screen and these readings, okay, this is the reading of line 1 and this is the reading of line 2. Okay, now just look at line 2 and here I am changing the position in horizontal direction. Now look at this line 2. Here, as you can see, voltage is 0. It means here voltage should be 0, and as you can see here voltage is 0. Okay, now again I'm changing its position. Now the voltage of line 2 should be changed. Now look at this point here. Voltage of line 2 is 2 volts, which is correct because here it is mentioned that 2 volts square wave should appear, which is correct here. Now as you can see, this line is not smooth and it has some ripples because when I am changing its position, this line 2 voltage is also changing. It's 1.96 now, it's 2 now. Okay, it means this waveform is not smooth and it has some ripples. Okay, so we can also find the minimum and maximum values of this ripple voltage. Now for this I'm going to use the scale knob for magnifying this waveform. Okay, here I'm just turning this scale knob for magnifying this waveform in order to measure the minimum and maximum values of ripple voltage. Okay, as you can see here, this ripple voltage is now very clear. So this is the maximum value of this ripple voltage, which is 2 volts. Okay, now for minimum value, again I will change its position. So here there should be the minimum value of this ripple voltage. Now look at this. The minimum value of this ripple voltage is 1.94 volts. Okay, so this is how you are going to use these switches of an oscilloscope for reading your waveform. Another objective of this practical is to get familiar with a function generator. As you can see here, we have a function generator. By using this function generator, we can set our waveform. Okay, we can choose what type of waveform we want. We can set its frequency, its amplitude, symmetry, mode, utility. Okay, as you can see here, this is the menu of this function generator. Now in order to change waveform, you will press this button here. Now after pressing this button, you can see here different options appear. Now you can choose what type of waveform you want. You can set sine wave, square wave, triangle wave, and you can also set the pulse, positive pulse, negative pulse, or DC only. Okay, now if I want square wave, I'm going to press this button here. Now after pressing this button, square wave is selected. Okay, now I will press this status button now. Now after pressing the status button, something like this will appear on the display. Here, as you can see, frequency is 10 kilohertz. I'm also changing frequency here by pressing this button. Now I'm going to use this knob for changing this frequency. I'm increasing the frequency, and I can also decrease this frequency here. And here I am setting frequency to 40 kilohertz. Okay, again I'll select this status button. Now as you can see here, 40 kilohertz frequency is set. Now I can also change the peak to peak amplitude of this waveform, which is 4, by pressing this button. Now as you can see here, the amplitude is 4 volts peak to peak. Now I'm also going to change this amplitude here. For this, again I'm going to use this knob. By turning this knob, you can either increase this peak to peak voltage or decrease it. Okay, here I'm going to set this peak to peak voltage 6 volts. Okay, again after setting this amplitude, you'll press this status button to check the status of your desired waveform. Now look at this status here. You have chosen square waveform. Its frequency is 60 kilohertz and amplitude is 6 peak to peak. Okay, here symmetry is 50%. Now what you are going to do, you are going to connect this function generator to this oscilloscope by using this channel here. As you can see, this channel is main output, so you will turn it on by pressing this button. Now this is how you are going to connect this oscilloscope to this function generator. Now here you wanted square waveform with 60 kilohertz frequency and 6 peak to peak voltage. Now look at this waveform. As you can see here, the frequency is now 60 kilohertz, and here peak to peak is 6 volts. It means there will be 3 volts in positive direction and 3 volts in negative direction. So as you can see here, peak voltage in positive direction is around 2.96 volts, because here we have ripples. Now what about negative direction? Again here you are changing the position of this waveform, and as you can see here, you have minus 3 volts in negative direction. It means this waveform is correct. This is what you wanted. Now you can change this waveform. It means if you want to make it triangular, then press this button here. Now I'm going to press this button for triangle waveform. Now as you can see here, this triangle waveform is selected, and now look at this display here. Now the waveform has become triangle. Now if I press this sine waveform here, for this I'm going to press this button. Now you have sine wave on display. Okay, similarly I can also change peak to peak amplitude of this waveform. For this I'll press this button. Now I'm going to use this knob for changing this peak to peak amplitude. Now here, as I'm changing amplitude here, amplitude is also changing here. Okay, now as you can see here, peak to peak amplitude is 2 volts. Now if we change position of this waveform here, peak voltage in positive direction is 1 volts. Okay, and the peak voltage in negative direction is also 1 volts, but with negative sign. It means here we have 2 peak to peak voltage of this waveform. Okay, now I can also change the frequency of this waveform by pressing this second button. Again, for changing this frequency, I'll use this knob here. Now here I am rotating this knob, and here, as you can see, frequency is changing. Now look at this waveform here. As you can see, the frequency is changing. Now here frequency is 70 kilohertz, and here we have 70 kilohertz. Okay, so this is how you are going to generate your desired waveform with the help of function generator. Okay, so this was your practical 4.